Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Catherine Grill, the CEO of Neolth, and I am back today with Dr. Claire Wheeler, our CMO, for another Neolth Ask the Experts live stream event. So you all voted and we listened, and today we're going to be talking about social media stress. So I'd like to invite Dr. Claire Wheeler to come off of mute to introduce yourself and maybe kick us off, Claire, by talking about what is social media stress and what are some of the trends that we're seeing today as far as how young people are using social media.
Hello, it's really great to be back for another one of our live streams. And thank you, Dr. Grill, for that introduction. This is something that is just absolutely fascinating to me because when I was a teenager, none of this existed, and it has completely changed the social landscape for young people. Mostly, well, I wouldn't say mostly for better or for worse. It's a mixed bag. First of all, it's really staggering to me to realize that people on average, and this is according to research, they check their phones 262 times a day. And obviously, as you go from age group to age group, this varies with younger people doing it more and more during the day. And then there's another peak as people get very old, but that's not what we're talking about today. And the thing is that up to about 95% of teens have access to social media through phones, not as much through their computers and through broadband, because that still tends to be skewed more toward families with more money. But according to the Pew Research Center, which just released a survey on all of this, the most popular outlets or social media outlets that teens engage with are YouTube. That's number one, used by about 95% of teenagers regularly. And TikTok is now the leading app that kids are using, that teenagers and young adults are using for their social interaction online. And that's been pretty amazing because TikTok, is relatively new. And of course, it used to be Facebook, but now only about a third of young people report using Facebook. It's kind of become where your parents and grandparents go. So it's an ever-changing landscape that you kind of have to keep up with. And that, by its very nature, just the changingness of it is part of what makes it so compelling, especially for young people, because young brains and young people tend to enjoy novelty and what's new and keeping up with each other. That tends to be more important at that age. There are also some differences between girls and boys, and I'm using those terms loosely in a world now where we recognize that gender is fluid, but if you want to just generally kind of divide the population into boys and girls, what we see is different outcomes, and it's really more concerning for girls than it is for boys in general. And then if you just look at where kids go, for example, teen boys are more likely than teen girls to go to YouTube. They all go to YouTube a lot, but for different things. And then Twitch, which is often used by gamers, and Reddit, which is also often centered around video games. As a gamer myself, I can say that I use those sites a lot, and it's mostly boys and males that are on those sites, because it's mostly males that interact in the gaming world. And there's an interesting quote from this study. It says, when a boy steps away from a gaming console, he doesn't spend the next few hours worrying about what other players are saying about him. Instagram, which is much more popular among girls than boys, on the other hand, can loom in a girl's mind even when the app is not open, driving hours of obsessive thought, worry, and shame. And this is, in a nutshell, what the problem is with social media, especially for girls and for any human that is really attached to social comparison. And we'll talk a little bit more about social comparison, but this is where a lot of the harm is being done. So it seems that boys go online very often to talk about games and gaming, or to be gross and to do silly things, and girls really go on to compare themselves to other people. And so, but then when you look at different communities, for example, BIPOC teens and teens who are members of the LGBTQI plus communities, that can be maybe even a little more intense in some ways, because they can be subject to a lot more bullying and abuse and stigma and stereotyping, but also within their communities, they have created a lot of very supportive and affirming social media communities. that is helpful to them. And so I think a lot of times in real life, the cohesiveness or sense of belongingness or positivity of a community can get translated online into social media communities, and we can do that more mindfully even if we're not part of those populations.
Yeah, really interesting stats. Thanks for sharing that. So I'm actually a millennial. I missed Gen Z just by a couple years, but I am somebody who uses social media. And I would say I'm probably pretty aware of my behaviors. Like when you said, oh, using TikTok, using Instagram and YouTube, but not really Facebook. And like, I feel like a lot of us who are listening are probably like, yeah, that resonates. I knew that. But just kind of hearing the numbers, like, oh, you're on your phone this many hours a day. I think you said 200 and something times you're opening your phone. I feel like that hits home a little bit, and you're like, oh yeah, that sounds right. And I am on my phone a lot, or I am on my computer a lot. So I think the first step is just building up that awareness of how often we're on devices and how we're using them. A lot of times I've actually seen this kind of narrative, I feel like it's spun out of control, especially sometimes in the health community where it's like social media, terrible, everybody should just quit. And I think especially for this younger generations, we need a more nuanced response to that. Like you were saying, it's first building awareness of how we're using it, and then building awareness of how we're using it where it might be negative. Like for example, the social comparison that can be really harmful to mental health, but then recognizing how we're using social media and it might be really good for mental health, like building community, especially if you're maybe somebody who has a hard time building community in person for various reasons. Maybe you don't live near people who have the same identities as you. You can do that online, and that's so great for your mental health. So I think really taking a more nuanced approach to this. Obviously, social media stress exists because you all voted for it pretty overwhelmingly, so you wanted to talk about it. But starting to piece apart, where does that stress come from? How can we try to avoid some of those things that cause the stress? And where do those protective factors, things that are good for our mental health, where do they come from? And how can we do more of that? So let's maybe jump into the first part, Dr. Wheeler. What are some of the biggest hazards associated with social media use, things that are bad for our mental health that we can start to identify and move away from doing?
Yes, this is a really important thing to think about. And what we'll get into in a little bit is the ways that these companies, the methods they use to try to get you hooked. But first of all, let's just look at some of the things that can go wrong or some of the hazards that are associated on top of or alongside the social comparison piece. One of them obviously is cyberbullying, and this is an ever-growing problem that tech companies seem to have some trouble getting a handle on. And so this is, an issue that a lot of times you can't control. And so it adds to the trauma of it. Obviously, invasion of privacy, not knowing where your data are going, suddenly getting a bunch of weird emails or texts as a result of participating online. That's something that can happen. Identity theft can happen. It's a real thing, even when you're younger. Once you have a bank account or even just a social security number, that's a really valuable asset that if someone else gets, they can do harm with. There's traumatizing or harmful imagery and content that a lot of younger kids are just not ready to see, not just online porn, but just scrolling through a news feed, you can see footage that can be very difficult for people to take in and process. And then finally, dangerous adults. And I'm not talking about tech executives here, but I'm just talking about people who are actually predatory online. And there can be some unnecessary hysteria around this, but it is definitely something that happens and is a risk for kids. So those are just some of the sort of the worst end of the spectrum harms that can occur, and they're not as common as some of the other stuff we're talking about, but they're definitely things to watch out for.
Yeah, I think cyberbullying is something that we hear a lot about and really falls into that probably comparison to others. So I was looking at a study recently, a peer-reviewed study. So for those of you out there who don't know, that's like a study that scientists did, and they submitted it to a journal, and other scientists looked through it to make sure all the data was correct and factual, and then it gets published. So peer-reviewed journals are really good things to read when you're looking for kind of science and fact-based things. And they were talking about how people use social media, and there were a couple different ways, but one was wanting to post and kind of share your own news, and then waiting to see what kind of external validation you get. So basically sharing a post, creating a post or a story, and then seeing how many likes or how many comments you get. And then the opposite was kind of seeing what other people do, and then, you know, wanting to like or comment on that. And those things weren't necessarily as bad. I think when you get into like comparisons, how much did I get versus somebody else, that's where it can be stressful. But those things actually really feed into that comparison to self and others. And that's the thing that can be really damaging. That connected with the cyberbullying. And there was one more thing I wanted to bring up really quickly, Dr. Wheeler, which was new to me that I've heard recently, which was called like self-cyberbullying, or some people are calling it digital self-harm, which is where people might go on and make fake social media accounts and then bully themselves and say negative things about themselves. And some teens have described this as, you know, feeling like, well, my peers are going to say bad things about me, so I kind of want to beat other people to the punch and like say it first. So I think that's another thing to be really aware of. If you're finding yourself comparing yourself to others, cyberbullying or bullying yourself, those are all things that could be harmful to your mental health, especially we're finding bullying yourself can be related to higher risk for suicide. So that's something that you might want to take a step back and be aware of. Am I doing this, or is a friend doing this? And want to see how you can maybe talk to a trusted adult about that, because that might be an indication that something is going on. So yeah, kind of diving into this a little bit more, Dr. Wheeler, can we start to talk about some of the mental health risks that are associated with social media?
Yeah, and it's important also to talk about how to protect oneself from those risks as well. Some of our listeners might be aware that there was a whistleblower from Facebook recently. Her name was Frances Haugen, and she got a lot of notoriety and fame and attention because she really brought to light some of the methods that are used by some social media companies to kind of keep teens coming back repeatedly and repeatedly, those 262 times a day. And she said that that teens blame Instagram for increases in the rate of anxiety and depression, and that this was consistent across all groups. And the roots of this anxiety and depression is, again, this social comparison. And so, and then if you even go from one app to another, say from Facebook to Instagram to Snapchat, they have different emphases. So some will emphasize your face with a lot of filters, some look at your body, but basically the whole idea here is objectification and projecting an image that isn't real. And so, you know, and it's really hard to be that one person who doesn't do that, right? If everyone else is using these filters, then you go on without. So there's a lot of peer pressure. And so I think it's helpful for teens to start to think about, you know, thinking about how other people's posts affect them, and then how your post might be affecting other people. And this kind of touches on that whole idea of self-awareness and social responsibility. But the other thing is also to think about, why do some of these companies do what they do? And a lot of it has to do with making a profit, and you make a profit by having more and more engagement. And so things like notifications they are designed by psychologists to keep bringing you back. So, and in fact, the color of the dot, the red versus a blue dot, that really makes a big difference. And as a neuroscientist, you probably know a lot about this, about how you can be triggered to perform a behavior. And it's really basic behaviorism. This is from the 1920s. It's like training a dog. There's a reward. So the cue is the red dot, and then you see that red dot and boom, you got to check and see what it is. And it may or may not be rewarding, but there's a dopamine response in the brain, and that is really capitalized. And now we are starting to talk about a phenomenon that we are calling social media addiction. And I'm not sure what we're going to be able to do about it, but experts believe that there may be about 10% of Americans now who have this. And some questions to ask yourself to see if social media might be becoming a problem for you is, do you spend a lot of time thinking about this or planning your posts? How much time in your day do you spend just actually creating content, and who is the content for, and why are you making it, and how does it make you feel afterwards? Ask yourself, what if nobody liked it, what you created, and what does that actually mean when someone likes or doesn't like something that you put out on social media, and how relevant is it really to your everyday life and the people that you actually interact with on a daily basis? Do you use social media to forget about your personal problems, or is it a distraction? Or is it actually a productive and happy and helpful part of your life? Do you often try to cut down on your use of social media and fail at that, or fail to do that? This is a very important sign of an unhealthy relationship. And it doesn't matter whether it's a person or your Xbox or Instagram. If you try to cut down your engagement with it and you can't, that's a red flag. And so in that case, you might need maybe to work with another person, or get some other type of support for wanting to do that. Do you get restless or uncomfortable if you can't use it? There's a great episode of The Office where this younger millennial character has to get rid of his phone for a trivia contest, and he just can't. He has to be with his phone. I know a lot of young people like that. I mean, can you be away from your phone for an hour without being uncomfortable or wondering what's going on your phone? And finally, can you honestly tell yourself that it has not had a negative impact on the things that are really important to you, like your relationships or your schoolwork or your job? So these are really good questions to ask. The next question is, now what do I do about all of this? And that's where things like becoming more aware of the tactics that are used to draw you in and hook you, and don't let yourself be a sheep, and to really start to engage with people IRL, in real life, and sort of taste the difference, and maybe even work with your friends to have times that you spend together without your phones and without social media, and start to build community that's more tactile, and while still trying to engage in a positive and healthy way with social media, because they are not going to go away.
I love that. Some really tactical advice at the end to wrap this up. So first is kind of building that awareness. We talked about general awareness of how often people are using their phones, are using social media. Not necessarily a bad thing if you are on there, but just starting to first build up that awareness, thinking through some of those questions Dr. Wheeler said. So are you feeling urges to use social media and like spending a lot of time planning your content? Are you trying to reduce social media? Maybe you've tried a couple times and haven't been able to, or felt really like uncomfortable or anxious when you haven't been on it. Or do you use social media so much where it's starting to get in the way of like you going to school, getting homework done, spending time with friends? So just kind of asking yourself those questions. And if any of the answers are yes, that might be an indication that something is going on there. So first kind of being aware of your social media behaviors and how they affect you. And then also kind of breaking it down into those positive and negative aspects of social media. Like we talked about, the solution might not just be, delete, get rid of social media everywhere for everyone. I've heard that discussed before. If that's a solution that you think works for you, that's great. That's what you should do. But if you don't think that works for you, kind of really diving into what are the kind of negative and positive effects of using social media. So I think really that social comparison. I've talked to some students where they've said, I get on, I think Pinterest is another one, or Instagram or TikTok. And if I start to notice that I'm comparing myself to other people, especially like visually how they look and I look, that's kind of my red flag. And I close the app. So just kind of starting to build that awareness of if that comparison is happening, that's when you might want to put the phone down. But if it's something around community where you're connecting with others, you're building relationship, you're finding a sense of belonging, that's really good. So trying to gravitate away from that comparison into the community might be a really healthy way to use social media. And then just even getting the conversation started, like talking about this. I know this was a quick live stream, so we're going to wrap up in a second here. We're really just kind of skimming the surface, but there's probably so much more that we can talk about. So we encourage you all to talk about it more with each other. We talk about this in our ambassador program. You can join our program and talk with other students about this, start the conversation online, start the conversation in your classroom, and really just start to build up that awareness and see where it goes. So Dr. Wheeler, thanks so much for joining us today. Any last words that you want to say as we close out this live stream?
No, just I think you summed it up well. It's a tool just like any other tool, and you get to choose how to use it. So use it well.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wheeler, for being here. And thank you everyone else for joining us. We are excited to be able to talk to you next month on another Ask the Experts live stream. As a reminder, you can vote for the topic of these live streams in the Neolth app in the community section. It's an anonymous poll, but you can vote for what you want us to talk about. And we'll see you next month in October. Bye, everyone.